for the departments. We provide the authorities and provide oversight when the department is not operating within their own authorities. In this case, they were.
Could you comment on the integrity regime, and should there be an expansion of the guidelines?
So the integrity regime is actually a PSPC responsibility. I'm pretty sure that you're hearing from them tomorrow, so a question more suited for them. But the integrity regime, to my knowledge, there's an update to the existing one. That's no. I'll pass it over to my colleague here on that one.
I would just say, in the context of our review last year on contracts, that PSPC noted that they are continuing to look at the integrity regime. And as Mr. Huppe said, they'll be here tomorrow to talk.
Okay, so we look forward to that. So now looking at all the outside contractors that were involved with this, how does the security clearance work for contractors? And are contractors able to begin work before having obtained the appropriate clearances?
So I'll take that question. Thank you, Mr. Chair, given that I have responsibility over the Directive on Security Management. I think the answer is no. They wouldn't have been able to begin work. There's a standard on security screening that outlines the security screening requirements for all duties and positions in the federal government, including those of contractors. They would have had to follow those rules. The responsibility, once again, though, resides with the deputy head and the chain of command and the delegated authorities within a particular department, including a chief security officer, to make sure that those guidelines and those rules are followed.
Okay, so outside IT contracting has definitely been put in the spotlight because of the ArriveCAN app. What is being done to address the frequent use of outside IT talent? Like, we use them to develop it, but then the AG pointed out there probably was opportunity for departments to take over management once they got it up and running. And that didn't actually happen. We've not really been given a good answer from anyone as to why that was the case. So I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts on this.
Thank you for the question. I'll take that again. From a chief information officer perspective, we have launched a directive on digital talent. It stands to reason that there is a significant talent deficit in technology in both the private and public sector, and the federal public service is obviously included in that. What we've done is we've put in place a directive that hopefully will strengthen the way that we collect data and centralize guidance on digital talent sources. We want to improve interdepartmental coordination on that. We want to augment government-wide tools and services. We've introduced a GC Digital Talent Platform, for example. What this directive on digital talent actually does, for example, is it will require managers seeking contract services to complete a digital services contracting questionnaire. If they want to use these talent augmentation contracts in IT, they have to check in with us and provide justification. So we're trying to imbue some discipline. At the same time, though, we can't ignore the fact that we still are going to need these contracts to use specialized expertise to temporarily augment our workforce to keep delivering on many projects. In this particular case, I think I would agree with the Auditor General. It stands to reason that we needed to rely on some of these contractors to get this application up and running. But as the application was developed and was put into play, it would have been expected, particularly going forward, that we rely on the employees of under the CIO within CBSA and the Public Health Agency to run it.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant, Madame Cycle Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Cycle Desgagnés, 2.5 minutes. Mr. Huppe, earlier you stated that deputy ministers are responsible for putting in place and applying the processes which are in place. And Public Services and Procurement Canada has processes for awarding non-competitive contracts. Yet the Treasury Board and probably the department that awards the most non-competitive contracts for amounts over and above $25,000. Now, even before the pandemic, 60% of the Treasury Board's contracts were awarded in a non-competitive fashion. So there was no guarantee vis-a-vis quality for money and value for money, that is. And a third of contracts over $100,000 were awarded in a non-competitive context. What would you have to say to that regarding adhering to processes, Mr. Hupe? Thank you very much for the question. And I'll perhaps defer to CFO Karen Cahill for a complement to this, to my response. But there is a policy for awarding contracts on a non-competitive basis. Now, that said, competition is always what's ideal. Now, when we do enter into non-competitive contracting, we require documentation as to why it's in our best interest to proceed with a non-competitive contract. Yes, no, I understand the process. I'm sorry to cut you off, Mr. Hupe. I have very little time. You're rehashing what we've already heard thousands of times at this committee. How is it that 60% of contracts are awarded non-competitively? And are you sure of the justifications that are given in those cases? And could you please provide a breakdown of what occurred in 2023, i.e. those 75 contracts of over $100,000 that were awarded in a non-competitive process, and what the justifications were for that? The CFO. Well, thank you very much. This is not a practice that we encourage. And yet it is the majority of contracts that are being awarded non-competitively. Yes, there are some circumstances whereby it's out of our hands. We have no choice but to award non-competitive contracts. Now, in those cases, we make sure we obtain the necessary justifications for all those contracts that are awarded, and it would be my pleasure, were it the desire of the committee, to furnish you with any information regarding those contracts. I think that's a yes. Yes, you'd like that? Yes, thank you very much. Following questioner.
For 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here and sharing this testimony with us today. I very much appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about how the ArriveCAN is, while this is the issue we're dealing with, it is clearly part of a bigger and very clearly broken system. I want to make some of those connections that are between the audit conducted of the government's contracts with McKinsey that you carried out last year and the report that's in front of us today. So I think there's some important and repeated conclusions in both reports that demonstrate that both conservative and liberal governments have had some real problems giving contracts to either their corporate insider friends or folks that know how the system works. So Ms. Hogan, your report on McKinsey found that administrative requirements were not consistently followed, and your report on ArriveCAN found the practices to manage the contracts were missing, quote, at the most basic level. So could you talk a little bit? Are you confident that the Treasury Board is taking enough of a leadership role over departments to implement procurement frameworks as they promised in response to your report?
So if I may just clarify the member, Mr. Chair, I have not issued a report on McKinsey. The report I believe that you're talking about was one that the Comptroller General's office did by asking all of the internal audit shops. I do have a report on professional services contracts coming, and at that time I'd be happy to draw some analogies between the two for you. So I think your question is probably best directed to the Comptroller General.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So actually, indeed, those reports were done by the internal audits of the departments that had contracts with McKinsey. There were, as you noted, weaknesses that were identified. The departments have action plan, but also at Treasury Board, we also produced a report, submitted it to OGO committee as to internally the modifications and changes that we had done to our policies to strengthen them in relations to the findings. Also produced a guide for managers to help them when they have to make a decision as to when and how they should engage in professional services. we were trying to provide them with, more tools for them to make the right decisions here.
So you identified weaknesses in both reports. You have come up with ways to strengthen the system. Do you feel like the system is adequately strengthened? Do you think that what happened with ArriveCan or with some of the contracts that we have with McKinsey, could that happen again?
So we've put measures in place as a result of these reviews. ArriveCan, obviously, the contracting was done in the pandemic in 2020. So hopefully, to respond to your question, hopefully the measures that we've put in place will show some improvements over the coming while, and hopefully that should there be audits in the future, that we would see an improvement on the weaknesses that were detected in these audits. And on the future audits coming from, we will obviously adjust any of our actions in line with, there's also a procurement ombudsman audit on McKinsey contracts that is coming soon, if I'm not mistaken, and I want to speak for him. And the Auditor General's also her audit that she spoke about.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Kuzi, you have the floor again for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think that it's very important to note that if the NDP member is very concerned about transparency regarding not only ArriveCan, but McKinsey, then she should be reminded that it is her party that blocked access to all of the documentation for this committee, as well as the Government Operations Committee to review, and that she should keep this in mind in the future. Should she truly want transparency and want to obtain all of the documentation for review, that she needs to convince her party to provide her the authority to access this documentation. Mr. Chair, as you know, as Shadow Minister for the Treasury Board, I take very much seriously the responsibility of this role, and I believe that the President of the Treasury Board should take just as much, if not more, responsibility in being in the actual role herself for such a debacle of ArriveCan. And I want to ask the Auditor General directly, Madam Auditor General, have you had a conversation with the President of the Treasury Board, regarding your report on ArriveCan?
No, I have not. Typically, I do brief some of the ministers prior to releasing a report so that they are well equipped to know what the findings will be. In this case, I kept that briefing quite tight and did not actually brief the Treasury Board before ArriveCan. I felt it was important that all parliamentarians receive the report at the same time.
Certainly, as President of the Treasury Board, were I in this role, I certainly would be contacting you directly for a personal briefing as soon as possible. And it's disappointing to hear that this didn't occur. Monsieur Huppé, have you had a conversation with the President of the Treasury Board specifically regarding the results of the Auditor General report on ArriveCan?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, I did. Exactly 2 weeks ago. Not last week, the Wednesday before, shortly after the le dépôt du rapport of the Auditor General, I had about a 40-minute discussion with the President as to, the findings and also the action plan that we would be working on to make sure that we deal with this adequately. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew here, who's got something I think he wants to add.
Just a quick clarification. I had a discussion with the Secretary of the Treasury Board where I informed the Secretary that we would not be having a briefing with the President. So that I want to make sure that it's clear that we were the ones that initiated that decision.
Thank you both. I will say, as President of the Treasury Board, I would have demanded one. I'll now pass my time to Mr. Barrett, please, Chair.
You have 2 minutes, Mr. Barrett.
Min Doan was hired as CTO, Chief Technology Officer, in June of 2023. How much in bonuses would he be paid for this year?
Decisions around bonuses will not have been made, so I don't have that information.
Okay. So Mr. Doan perjured himself in front of a parliamentary committee that's lying for the uninitiated. Is that the type of thing that disqualifies a CTO from a bonus?
I'm not sure how to answer that question in the sense that, there's a lot of hypotheticals in the way that you posed it.
If someone lies to a standing committee of the